This is in fact the third part of the 6 lectures, which will consist of 2 lectures, one today on negotiation, and then next week the last class will be about speech writing, speech delivery, perhaps if we have some time, interacting with assertive/aggressive press, which can be a painful undertaking. Now, to come back to the very first lesson, you remember that there were different approaches to diplomacy. There was the kind of descriptive diplomacy, the normative one, which we kind of looked at last week when we studied the concept of war. And then the very last approach was what we called the practical or pragmatic approach. And that was the answer to the question, what is diplomacy? Very simply, diplomacy is what the diplomat does. What is medicine? Medicine is what a doctor does. Of course, that's slightly reductive, but to some extent it goes to the essence of diplomacy, because diplomacy is indeed what the diplomat does. And at the core of what he does, you definitely have negotiation. Some books even say diplomacy is the art of negotiation. I told you it's slightly reductive, but it goes to a very important point of what diplomacy is about. So today we will look at negotiation. And we will do that in 3 stages, because the setting of a negotiation is a rather complex thing. Not much people see it that way, but when you want to be a good negotiator, you have to know that there is a lot of implicit stuff there. That is that the framework in which you negotiate is part of your negotiation. Very often, you don't have to ask those questions explicitly because they have been answered through, for instance, the rules of procedure. But sometimes it happens that you enter into a negotiation and that there are not rules of procedure, that therefore you have to think for yourself, look, what kind of game do I enter into here? And that is why I will in fact explicitate what very often is implicit. That's the first part. The second part is the kind of stuff everybody tells you about negotiation, that is the technique of negotiation. What is a good negotiator? And I will go through 10 rules, which I call, just for fun, the 10 golden rules of the effective negotiator. You will see that, in fact, those rules are just common sense made somewhat more explicit. But when you just think about it, how should I behave in this negotiation situation, and you try to play it a little bit smart, you easily come to those rules. But again, as with the first part, it's good sometimes to make things explicit, just to put them clearly before your mind, because if they are clearly before your mind, then you probably won't fall into the traps of a negotiation, because a negotiating situation is a controversial situation. It's a situation where you have a proponent and an opponent, a protagonist and an antagonist. And therefore, you should be aware that if the other guys know his roles more better because he has been thinking about it, even though implicitly they are part of your common sense, then he may play the game in a smarter way than you do. So better be prepared to properly understand what those rules are exactly. But that's the second part, the kind of negotiation techniques part, and also the traps, the red herring, the straw man. We briefly will say something on these traps. Again, traps that a lot of people know about, but still, when the trap is there, they very often fall into it. So you have to make these things very explicit so that you are fully aware about the game you're entering in. And then the last part, and I put it separately because I want to give it the necessary emphasis, goes around the concept of empathy. And I gave that a separate kind of treatment, if I may say so, because empathy is key to successful negotiation. What is empathy about? It's not sympathy. And even within empathy, some people make a distinction between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. We will be speaking about cognitive empathy. That really means that you have to put yourself in the mind of the other. And putting yourself in the mind of the other is not just co-feeling with him, it's properly understanding him. And properly understanding is not just saying, I understand what he says, it's going deeper and try to find out why he says what he is saying. But we'll come back to that. So these are the three parts that we will briefly walk through it. I make sure that we end at something like 6:10, 6:15, so that there is room for questions. So we start with the general framework. And as I told you, very often these elements of the framework are not made very explicit. As I told you, negotiation is in fact a verbal interaction, a linguistic interaction between parties who have opposed interests. There is a dispute, there was a conflict that they have to overcome. And the fact that they are willing to negotiate shows already that they are willing to overcome that dispute that divides them. And they will try to reach an agreement. And very often that agreement will not be the position of 8 or 1 of the parties. It very often will be a compromise formula, a middle of the road formula. The mere fact, of course, that you're willing to negotiate shows your willingness also to put some water in your wine. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to even enter into negotiation. So the willingness to negotiate shows that you are prepared to revisit your own position. The element of good faith is a very important element in a negotiation. And that's one of the points I will make explicit later on. But so, the framework, what is that framework? Well, that framework invites you to ask a couple of questions. As I told you, in most of the situations, you don't have to ask those questions implicitly because they have been answered by the institutional setting in which you are negotiating. For instance, I have had the privilege, as you know, to negotiate in the Security Council representing Belgium as a non-permanent member. And there, of course, I didn't really have to ask with whom I'm going to negotiate. That was being preset by the mere fact that I was an ambassador to the United Nations. And I didn't have to question what we are going to discuss, with whom we are going to discuss, but there may be settings. For instance, when you want to resolve a problem for which there is no institution that gives you a forum, a platform in which you can negotiate, where you have to ask a couple of preliminary questions. And the first preliminary question, well, the preliminary question generally is, am I willing to enter into negotiation? That's the very question you have to ask for yourself. But that question can be broken down in a couple of sub-questions. And the first sub-question, obviously, is the who question. Am I prepared to negotiate with that guy? So the identity of the party with whom you may enter into a negotiation is the first issue to be addressed. Am I willing to discuss with that party? There may be reasons why you are not willing to discuss with that party. Because, for instance, it is a party that has been, e.g., condemned before an international tribunal. Many people were not willing to even sit at the table with people like Mladic. And as you have heard, just last week Mladic was being convicted by the so-called Yugoslav Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia to perpetuity, as a matter of fact, on the ground of genocide. We spoke about genocide, and I told you that this is a sufficient legitimate ground for entering into an armed action, to undertake an armed action. So the identity of the party is the first question that you have to address. Now, as I told you, in some settings you don't have to address that, and I just want to single out one setting, which is the setting of an international organization. When you enter the COREPER, the Committee of the Permanent Representatives of the European Union, which is the body just below the Council, you don't raise your hand and say to the President, I'm unwilling to discuss with the Hungarian ambassador because I disagree with Viktor Orban's policies. You can't do that for the simple reason that the question whether you want or do not want to discuss with him has already been settled. It has been settled by the simple fact that that ambassador has been properly, what we call, accredited to the organization. He has given his credentials, his letters of credence, to the president of the organization, being the European Union, and that fact by itself, the fact that these credentials have been accepted by the institution, gives him legitimacy as far as his place in the COREPER is concerned. The same is true for the Security Council. You are just with 15. You are not going to question the legitimacy of the Russian ambassador there. The Russian ambassador has been properly accredited to the institution, and therefore he is obligatory your partner in a discussion, including in a controversial discussion, which, as I told you, is always the topic of your negotiation. So that's the first question, the who question, the identity of the person with whom you are willing to negotiate. The second question is the what question, the topic on which you are going to negotiate. The issue which is the object of the controversy. Now again, normally you have to have a kind of pre-discussion, provided you're willing to discuss with the party. You need to have a kind of pre-discussion in terms of, am I willing to discuss this topic? There may simply be topics that you say they are off, they are not on the table, they are no-go areas. I don't want to discuss about this issue. For instance, an issue that very often is off, no-go area are boundary questions. Boundary questions are questions which arise a lot in international settings, and very often a party is willing to discuss a lot, willing to discuss neighboring relationships, willing to discuss minorities or refugees having crossed the border and that kind of things, but not the border question itself. For instance, between Ethiopia and Ethiopia and what's the neighbor again? Eritrea. There is a long-standing discussion about the border. It's a very long border. There are, of course, no border signs whatsoever. There is almost no population living there. There are just some goats going around there, but still, it's a hot topic of discussion, and one of the reasons why the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia has for so long been problematic is because that border is being contested. So the second thing is, am I really willing to discuss this matter? So that's the second one. First, the person or the identity of the party. Second, the topic, the admissibility of the topic. Now again, as I made an exception, and a big exception, for the who question in terms of international settings, again, in those settings of international organizations, there is a way of agreeing on the topics, and that is what we call the agenda setting. So there's no somebody raising the hand, I want to discuss this. No, you have, in the first stage, in the preliminary stage, to discuss with the others around the table, are we agreed that we will be discussing on this topic? And that is what we call the agenda setting. I mentioned that specifically because the rules which apply to the agenda setting, to the question, what are we überhaupt going to discuss, very often are different from the rules that will be deciding on the subject matter itself. I explain myself, as you know, in the Security Council, just as an example, but we have even more sophisticated examples here within the European Union, but in the Security Council, on substantive issues, on the merits proper of a case, when you have negotiated, not found a consensus, and that you feel obliged to call for a vote, there the rule is that you need 9 out of the 15 votes, which are also voices. It being provided that the 5 permanent members must agree on the topic. As you know, they have a veto. But 9 out of 15 is not very much. As a matter of fact, it's even less than most of the majority rules which are of application within the European Union. I just want to draw your attention on that. 9 out of 15 is just a little above 7.5 out of 15, which is just a simple majority. Simple majority is an exception in a lot of organizations. So you see that in a certain sense, the Security Council was already a relatively revolutionary body as far as the decision-making machinery is concerned, and more specifically the voting procedures. So 9 out of 15 with the 5 permanent members included for substantive issues. But for the agenda setting, which is considered a procedural issue, not a substantive issue, it's a simple majority, which means 8. If a simple majority, that is 8 countries, members of the Security Council, agree that a certain controversial point will be discussed, then it will be discussed, and veto does not play a role. So the Americans may be very much upset that once again the Israelo-Palestinian issue is on the agenda. They can't block it, because in most cases you have easily your 8 votes to discuss that topic. So that's the agenda setting, still related to that question of the what. So we looked at the who, at the what. Now we are going to look at the when, and that's the time question. Whenever you start a negotiation, you have to ask for yourself, do I have the time to negotiate? It may be that the situation is so serious, so pressing, that you can't even go through the movies of a negotiation. You remember last time we spoke about imminent threats, proximate threats. If a threat is indeed imminent, you can't bring the dispute before the Council or before the Coreper or what is it, although the Coreper is not really working in real times, is not addressing that kind of imminent issues about which we spoke last week. But you can't very often just wait and say, let's negotiate over that in the Security Council. Very often you don't have the time. Also, it may be possible that you and others say, look, I don't want to negotiate about that. I don't want to discuss at length about that, because I fear that the party that is asking for this topic to come on the fore is just doing that for out of consideration of delaying the issue, delaying tactics, filibustering, if you want. Filibustering is a term that we more use in the context of domestic politics, and more particularly in parliamentary discussions, and even more particularly in the US Congress, where there are a whole bunch of techniques for filibustering by raising a procedural issue, which again delays the issue to be treated with 2 weeks, and then there is a counter filibustering and you lose another 2 weeks. That's a little bit the spirit when I evoke the when question, the time question, that is that you have to be wary about the malevolent intent of another party, that he just wants to buy time to his own advantage, but also see for yourself whether the crisis is not of such a nature that it needs to be addressed at once, not through peaceful means of negotiation, but through military action. And for that, I refer back to what we said last week. So that was the when question. Another question that is very often overseen is the question of the minimal common ground. Now again, let's suppose we are not in Security Council, not in the Coreper, what is it? We are in a negotiation ad hoc. There is a controversy between two countries. They are willing to sit together, perhaps once in the capital of country A and the other time in capital B, but there are no preset rules, and they have for themselves to make out whether they enter into that negotiations, because we are still addressing what I call the preliminary questions related to the very preliminary question, am I überhaupt willing to negotiate? Okay, so part, and that's the fourth one, of those questions is the question, is there sufficient common ground? What do we mean with this? With this, we simply mean, well, we mean what it says. We simply mean that you have to check whether between you and your adversary, between you, the proponent, and the opponent, whether there is enough commonality of values, norms, commonality of agreed principles, enough of them for both of you to transcend your problem. If you know that the other party does reject the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, does reject the majority of the rules of international law, is not willing to start negotiating with you in good faith, then you know there is not sufficient common ground anyway, even to start and sit at the table and discuss with that party. So the element of sufficient, minimal common ground is very often overseen, but it is a question that you have to decide for yourself. Is the set of common beliefs that I have with the other party, the set of shared beliefs, the set of accepted principles, critical enough that it's meaningful to start negotiating? And the last point on which you have to have a minimal understanding is what we will call the rules of the game, that are the rules that govern the conduct of the negotiation. Now, the question is not, do I negotiate or not? provided the four prior questions I mentioned are positively answered, then the last question that you have to ask is which will be the rules that govern the game of negotiation, and do we have common ground on those rules as well? Very often those rules are implicit as well. They are what people call tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that you have in you, sometimes knowledge that you are not aware about, but that is there in terms of what you're doing or not doing. The rules of the game, again, sometimes have to be explicitly stipulated. We will behave according to rule 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will go through a series of them. But sometimes you don't really have to stipulate them explicitly. Sometimes you find them in what is being called the rules of procedure. Most bodies, the COREPER, the Council, the European Council, the Security Council, the General Assembly of the United Nations, most of the bodies have rules of procedure anyway. That is, for instance, in the European Parliament, your time for speaking is limited. And as you know, there is now a new system, well, since about 2 years, there is a system that shows you exactly how many minutes you have to start with. On average, that is 2 to 3 minutes, no more. And then the thing goes down. As soon as you get at 15 seconds, it becomes red and flashes. 5, it becomes very brightly red. And at 0, it's simply cut off. So you may be willing to explain whatever more, etc. Your mic is off. So this is a rule of procedure. So I don't have to, if I have to discuss with you, negotiate with you, in that case, to preliminarily agree, yeah, but you won't speak for half an hour because you are filibustering, you want to buy time, it's already 11 o'clock at night, you know that everybody will be going at the latest at 3 a.m. and you're just spoiling the game. You don't have to do that in a setting where there are rules of procedure. But when there are not rules of procedure, you have somehow to know what you will be agreeing with your other party, what are the rules of the game. And now I will go through a few of them. Again, this is not written in iron. These are rules which are the most common rules of the proper behavior in the negotiation. Not about the negotiation, but the rules of conduct within the negotiation, the minimum rules for the proper conduct of the negotiation. And in fact, you have to think about it, that these rules have to be respected, and that is a kind of a regulative element. You have to live with those rules, so they are regulations. They have a regulative aspect to it, but in a certain sense, and think about it, they are also constitutive of your negotiation. A negotiation where those rules are not being properly respected simply is not a negotiation. It's a little bit like a chess game. A chess game, you have a lot of rules there. You have to follow them. That's the regulative aspect of the chess game. But if you ask, what is a chess game? What constitutes a chess game? Well, then it's the rules of chess that make the game. So you have that kind of double aspect, that these rules, you have to respect them in order for having a proper negotiation, but also it's only by respecting them that you have a negotiation proper. Short of respecting those rules, you don't have a negotiation. And that you can sometimes see when in a negotiation situation somebody just stands up and say, look, sorry, I go. This is not a negotiation anymore. And you will see when we go to the rules. As I told you, these rules are not really made very often explicit, because they are so much part of what you understand to be a negotiation. Once you go in a negotiation, that is what you try to do. But I will explicitate them for the reason I already explained to you. The first one, and I have here 11 of them, this could be as well 6 or 7 or 15, everything depends about how you conceptualize them. But the first is be informative. And to be informative, it's rather obvious, right? Informative means that the piece of information you add to the debate is of such a nature that it advances the debate. Don't start saying things which don't have to see much with debate. You have to be informative. A slightly different rule, but it's very close to being informative, is be relevant. And with being relevant, what we mainly mean, being informative means whatever you say should be part of the puzzle that we are constructing. That's informative. Be relevant means stick to the topic. Tell us things which have something to see with our controversy. And that will be more clear when I give you the example of the straw man. So each rule, be informative, be relevant, be perspicuous, be charitable, has a kind of negative, which we call then a fallacy. I don't want to go to the whole set of fallacies, but most of the rules, when not respecting them, you have a fallacy. And for instance, the fallacy corresponding with the rule of relevance is what is being called a straw man. But I'll come back to that. So be informative, be relevant, that is, stick to the topic. Third rule, be perspicuous. Avoid obscurity of expression, avoid ambiguity, be brief, avoid unnecessary prolixity. So that is the rule of perspicuosity. Again, rather obvious, but it's good to have it in your mind. The fourth rule is a rather important rule. It's be charitable, and that may seem to you a rather strange concept to enter into a discussion about what a negotiation is, but the principle of charity is a very important principle in a negotiation setting. What is the principle of charity? Basically, it is that you should, in good faith, try to understand as best as you can what your opponent is telling you. In other terms, don't put your prejudices don't let your prejudices overwhelm your own thinking. Be open to what he's saying, and even if your opponent is not expressing himself very rhetorically, his oratory talent may be somewhat short, still you can know what he means. And you very often know what he means, but you may do as if you didn't understand him because you just want, as it were, put him on the side and continue on your track. That's the principle of charity. Very often people think that my concession is a sacrifice. That my objective is sacrosanct, but his is only an illusion. So you have to go away from that. You have to not to think that your concession always is a big sacrifice and that his concession is just marginal. You don't always have to think that my objective is sacrosanct and his objective is just an illusion. You have to try to empathically, and you see the word is already there, try to understand the other guy by giving him some advantage, some kind of advantage in terms of, yes, if we want to have a rational, effective negotiation, then I have to go along with you and I have to give you the space you need to express yourself, even though you may not always express yourself very clearly. So make an effort to get his point even when he does not express himself clearly. That's the principle of charity. So be charitable. The next point is be committed. You are bound by the statements you made, and you cannot come back on them. That's the commitment point. Once you have made a point, you are committed to it. You made a commitment. You can't always withdraw what you just said. You said it, so you're committed to that. That is also the reason why in a negotiation situation, very often the president, the presiding officer, will from time to time kind of stop the negotiation and say, look, dear friends, that is where we are now. I have noted that the party A has set A, B, and C. Party B has set D and E. Party M has set truck. So he makes a kind of wrap-up. Where are we? Where are we now in, let us say, one of the stages of a negotiation? Why does the president do that? The guy who is presiding over the negotiation. He locks in just to make sure that the parties who have made those points cannot reverse those points, come back to it. That is also why, and on this we will come later on, why you have to be thinking twice before you make a commitment. So before you make a statement, think twice, because once you make it, you're committed to it. But on that we will come later on. But this is an important point. Look, being informative, rather obvious. Being relevant, sticking to the point, it's important. I'll come back to that. Be perspicuous, no obscurities, express yourself clearly, rather obvious. Be charitable, again, it's important to kind of understand the guy and be willing to understand him. Be committed is a very important point, because you're bound by what you said. Next rule is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That's a standard principle of negotiation, which is slightly contradictory with the point I just made. I said once you have said something, you are committed to it, and now I say nothing is agreed unless everything is agreed. The point is the following: every commitment you made is locked in. You cannot come back to that. But of course, if at the end of the game, at the end of the negotiation, when ready to close it, some parties have not given in or not made the necessary compromise or not made the commitment that you expect from them, then all commitments fall and nothing binds you anymore. So nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. This rule, in fact, encourages you to make commitments. Because if you had not that guarantee that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, then you would be very reluctant in making commitments. The commitments I just spoke about. You would not do that if you don't have the guarantee that nothing is agreed, if not everything is agreed. Because otherwise, the other party may be a free rider, and he goes away with the concessions you made without him having made the concessions you needed to make your point. The continuity rule is somewhat less important, but not unimportant, otherwise I wouldn't mention that. That basically is that you should continue up to the finish. When you start a negotiation, the idea is that you go to the finish. The idea is not, let's discuss for an hour and then go home and perhaps we see each other tomorrow again. The idea is we go to the finish. And there's also a reason why in diplomacy there is that fiction of setting the clock, fixing it at 12 o'clock. Normally, very often negotiations are being conducted in such a way that the parties say, look, by 12 o'clock we need to find an agreement. That is a kind of symbolic constraint, psychological constraint for having the parties really engaged in the negotiation. That is why you set a kind of that not line, but that hour. In the reality, however, when you get close to 12 and you see that your negotiation is going, that there is still momentum in the negotiation, what they then do is fix the clock and it just doesn't move anymore. So you never go beyond the 12. And they do it literally. They really set the clock and they put it on 12 o'clock at night and you continue. This shows you that there is a lot of psychology in a negotiation going on as well. What you can do when the negotiation is exhausted without having a total result, instead of just each of the parties going their own way and letting everything fall down, there is the rule of agreeing to disagree, which is kind of interesting, because what it does is basically diffusing somewhat the situation. So on the subject proper, we have not reached an agreement, but we agree on our disagreement, which smoothens out the disagreement and which means that for all practical purposes, on all other issues, we'll continue to work together. And that very often happens, including in the European Union, that they say, and this is of course not formalized in written conclusions, but look, we had a difficult time. Unfortunately, we were not in a position to bridge the gap which existed between my friend and colleague here and myself, but we agreed to disagree. We'll probably come back to the issue sometime later, not tomorrow, because we have to go back to our capitals, discuss with our people whether there is some more margin. So we simply agreed to disagree for the time being, and we certainly will see each other back. You feel that this is a way of parting away from each other, totally different than simply say, oh, you fool, we didn't agree, and that's I don't know whether ever I want to discuss any more with you and that kind of things. That's the agree to disagree when negotiating is hosted without result, rather than simply walk away, provide for opportunity to take up the negotiation again at a later time. The limitation rule is the 9th one in my list. And that is that in order to avoid that the negotiation continues indefinitely, one must put limits on the justifications and legitimations that you can ask from the other party. That's a rather heavy way for, again, saying something simple. As I told you, most of these rules are common sense anyway. That is that you can do as children do. Why does the Earth turn? It turns because there is a gravitational pull and what have you. Why is there a gravitational pull? Yeah, there's a gravitational pull because besides the sun, there is also the center of the universe. Why is there a center of the universe? Yeah, the universe is extremely large, but there is always a center in whatever you have. Yeah, but why is the universe? Well, the point is that you can, of course, in a negotiation situation, always push your opponent and say, yeah, you said this and that, but why did you say that? You used that word. Can you explain that word? Yeah, but in your definition of that word, you use the term. What do you mean with that? So that is the limitation rule. And then very often it's the president who comes in and who simply says, look, enough is enough. We understood what he means. We are not here in an academic setting where we have to go over definitions, and you could as well consult a dictionary of what is it. Limitation rule means that there are limits on the justifications and legitimations that you can request from another party, because otherwise you lose yourself in what they call an infinite regress. You know, you can regress infinitely and your negotiation never will come to an end. The symmetry rule is a very important rule as well, and again the president normally will watch over the fact that that rule is being respected. It is basically the rule of the equality of the parties. And equality of the parties in a negotiation means also that there is reciprocity. When he has 5 minutes to speak, I also am entitled to speak for 5 minutes. When he can ask questions on a delicate topic, me too, I am allowed to ask that kind of questions. That's the rule of symmetry. It means equal treatment for everybody, no intimidation by one party of another. All of us are equal participants in the debate. All of us are entitled to ask questions. All of us are entitled to raise objections. The symmetry rule. And the last rule is the burden of proof rule. And that is a very important rule indeed. And you just have to ask for yourself the question, there is a controversy between party A and party B. And then you can ask the question, who of the two parties have to prove what? Is it me who have to make the case that I am right? Or is it the other who has to make the case that he is right? Who will say? And then enters the rule of the burden on proof, on who rests the burden to prove his case. And there, as a rule, you have a standard, but which is discussable. You have a standard that the party that deviates from the normal, that is the party on whose shoulders rests the burden of proof. So the idea, the basic idea is the deviation of the normality. Now, as you can easily understand, the question is there, what's the normal? You know, in economics and so we also ask, we sometimes speak about the new normal. There is a new normal. In all discussions we have, in everything we think and we do in life, there is always a kind of implicit presupposition, that's the normal. And whatever deviates from the normal is the abnormal. And if somebody pretends something that deviates from the normal, the burden of proof is for him. Well, in diplomacy, it's the same. But, granted, it's not always easy to know what the normal is. And that in itself can be discussed, of course. But somehow, you have to accept that there is a kind of background set of beliefs that constitute the normal. And that will be that kind of common background set of beliefs that is being shared among our diplomatic community or humankind at large. That is the normal. And somebody who then deviates from that normal has the burden of proof. So these are some of the rules that I would identify as being those games, those rules of the game on which there has to be a proper understanding that these are the rules by which we will stick in the course of a negotiation. I will skip the fallacies because I see it's already 5 to 6. But except for giving you a flavor of what these fallacies are, I will mention 2 of them, the red herring and the straw man. Are some of you familiar with those fallacies? No? Well, the red herring is not to address the issue at stake, to wander off of what is being debated, to prove what is not even being contested. It is with the result that the negotiation is, with the result of such a red herring is that you kind of try to sidetrack the negotiation, to divert from it, and start a false debate. Now, a good negotiator can bring into the debate a red herring without people really being aware. But you see the tactical aspect of that. The tactical aspect is there is a discussion on topic A, and I start bringing in considerations of A plus and A++, and it somehow seems related to the issue, but in fact it's a totally different question. And I do that in order to deviate from the debate proper, because the issue at stake itself for me is disadvantage. I don't feel like winning that party anyway. I don't have solid arguments. So I kind of deviate it, sidetrack it on something else. Now, I told you that the fallacies that you find in a negotiating situation always correspond to one of the rules I mentioned. And that, of course, is a fallacy against the rule of relevance. Be relevant means stick to the topic. The red herring is typically something that has nothing to see with the topic. Of course, apparently yes, because that will be the art of the guy who brings in the red herring. He will do as if it is related, but if you take it on its own merit, you say, no, sorry, dear friend, this has nothing to see with the point which is here. And you can do that forcefully in a negotiation situation when something tries to bring in a red herring. The second one, and then I stop as far as these preliminary rules are concerned, the second one is the straw man. The straw man is, you, for instance, you have made a development of your argument and so on, and then I am part of the opponents, because it's not, in most negotiation situations, you are not just two parties, there are multiple parties, but you have made a keen, clear, objective presentation of what your position is. And maliciously, I will then say, oh, dear colleague, I understood you properly. So basically, what you said is that, and then you start setting up what they call a straw man. You kind of gave a paraphrase of what he said, but you gave it in such a distorted way that in fact the issue becomes again another one that is much more to your advantage. An example, for instance, is, well, you give a distorted picture of what your opponent has been saying, tendencies, paraphrasing, and then what you do, after having tendenciously paraphrased your opponent, then you kind of demolish the whole thing. But of course, it's a false presentation you brought, and it's not difficult for you to demolish that false thing, which was not properly reflecting what the other said. For instance, and I have a quote here, this can happen in subtle ways, particularly by making negative statements. For instance, you have been making a development, and I then say, I am not in favor of a military intervention. But you never spoke about a military intervention. What you said was, Mr. President, this has been a repeating offense against the principles of the Charter. A tough position on behalf of this Security Council is necessary. Then I say, Mr. President, I fully try to understand what my colleague just said, but I, for one, I'm against a military intervention. But he never spoke about a military intervention. He spoke about being tough. But then I have put something new in the debate, and others which perhaps have not properly followed the debate start siding with me. And of course, the ambassador is right. We are not for military intervention. Sorry, dear colleague, your tough position is not mine. That is a straw man. You said this. I kind of paraphrase it in an improper way. Then I say, this is impossible. We are not for war. But in the meantime, I put that person, my opponent, in a difficult position. Because now everybody is talking about the military intervention. He never spoke about the military intervention, but still he feels like he has defended himself by saying, but I did not speak about the military intervention, so you are in a rather embarrassing situation. This again, this is something, the symmetry in terms of the rules. This clearly, a straw man is a fallacy that goes against the rule of relevance, against the rule of symmetry, against perhaps the rules of principle of charity. You are not charitable with your counterpart. Right, I leave it at that. There are a lot of other fallacies. You can find that in most of the little booklets on informal logic and that kind of things. Right. Let's quickly go over the rules of negotiation proper, and then I will say very short something on the empathy question. Well, to be a good negotiator is not really very difficult. As I told you, most of the rules are common sense. But it's good to have them before your eyes. I have been reading a lot of little booklets and bigger books on negotiation, very written by people who never sat in an actual negotiation. It's learned material, it's sophisticated reasonings. And I come down to the fact that the few rules that I wrote myself down out of my own experiences over many years are in fact the rules that you have to keep in mind. The first rule, and you will be astonished by its simplicity, is know what you are talking about. Just know what you are talking about. In other terms, know your file, know the issue, did some study work. There is nothing that is more damaging for your position as a negotiator as soon as the others start feeling that in fact you don't know what you're talking about. And we have lived through such situations when we were talking about the non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation issue of Iran. That was an issue that the Security Council had been treated about in the years 2001-2. Then it was calm, it was kind of out of the scope of the Security Council. And then in 2007 it came up again because there were serious misgivings about the Iranian program that was being taken up again. And then we had a president, I won't name him, I won't name the country. You know that the presidency of the Security Council changes every month. So there is a rotation among the 15. Every other month it's somebody else. And it was the first day of his presidency, and it was even a Sunday, so there was an urgent matter there. We had to discuss the non-proliferation issue of Iran. Now, proliferation issues are complicated. They are being treated, as some of you may know, by the agency in Vienna, the famous International Agency on Nuclear Non-Proliferation in Vienna. Complicated rules, special regimes, inspection regimes, and that kind of things. You have really to know what you're talking about when you start doing that, particularly when you are presiding over a negotiation, going over those tricky issues. Well, he didn't know his file. He ridiculed himself, and his authority was simply broken as of day one as President of the Security Council, which is, of course, a very damaging situation you can find yourself in. So the first rule is really study your file. And when you are in the Security Council, I can tell you, it's a little bit like you students. Once the week rolls, you don't have much time to prepare your papers and so on. You have to do it in the weekends. Security Council is exactly the same. It's in the weekends that you already start looking at the different issues that come on you, because once the week is there, you don't have time to study these matters. Second point, know your proper place in a negotiation situation. Look, all the countries in the Security Council are different, but there are at least two clear categories. You have the permanent members and the non-permanent members. So the first thing for a non-permanent member is, please do know you are not permanent members. It's another class. Whether you like it or not, it's a second class. But then even with that knowledge, even with that, you still have to see what is my place here. What is my place here in terms of, is this a point where I should come out starkly, or I leave that over? For instance, sometimes there are disputes in Security Council which are being negotiated, and your country doesn't really have a stake in it. Hands off. Why are you, who have no interest, intrinsic interest in the matter that is being negotiated, that is being discussed, why should you come into the debate? The other one will say that you just complicate matters. It's already complicated enough. You don't have an interest. You kind of make yourself ridicule, if I may say so, because the others know that you don't have an interest. It's just to show off. Oh, I can also discuss about this issue, although I don't have any interest whatsoever, so better keep shut. But knowing your place doesn't mean that you always have to fade down. Sometimes, when it is an issue where you have serious interest, or when it is an issue where you really know what you're talking about, because you have been living in such situations, what is it? Humanitarian situations, human rights abuses, and so on, then you can stand up and say, Mr. President, I myself, I lived in a very conflictual situation in Lebanon. I can tell you the number of ceasefires that have been there have been numerous. It's not a ceasefire that we should be looking for, it's a cessation of hostilities. You remember I already made that distinction. So know your place, and there is, for each and any of the members of Security Council, there is a kind of natural place that you have to think about, what is my place here. Another distinction, third rule, is know the difference between power and authority. Power, that is something that great powers have. The US, Russia, China, they have power. European Union, I already would have some doubts, but the European Union is not a member of the Security Council. London, Paris, France, UK, permanent members, less than the other permanent members. You, as a non-permanent member, power, not really. You have mid-ranking powers, like Turkey, India, perhaps Egypt, but then they have other qualities which don't fit too well into the setting of a Security Council. But countries like Spain, Belgium, Sweden, we don't have power. What do we have? Or what should we have? Or what should we be working at obtaining is authority. And these two things play in a negotiation situation. Power basically means the US ambassador opens his mouth, and whether he's right or not, whether it's sophisticated or not, somehow you better take account of what he said. Which doesn't mean that you have to agree or that you cannot contest it. But somehow you know that when the US, the Russians, the Chinese, to some extent, lesser extent, when they open their mouth, you better listen to what they say. You don't have the power, but you can have authority, because you know very well how the situation is, because your argumentation is a very pertinent argumentation. It's very difficult, even for that big power, to counter your argumentation, because you're right on spot, because you put your finger exactly on the weak spot of even that great power. And that is authority. I always said to my guys in the embassy, we call that a permanent representation when you are in the multilateral setting, we can only survive through quality. We don't have a power base. Quality is what we need to work for, and quality is what gives you authority. And authority is something that the others will recognize very fast once you are on the right track. So distinction between power and authority is very important. By the way, that distinction can be used in many contexts as well. Just keep, it's a little bit like the distinction we made last week between legality and legitimacy. You remember, legality is the purest position, is this legal or not? Even when it's legal, I said there are other questions to be addressed, legitimacy questions. Does it make sense? Is it feasible? Am I not going to lose more than to win more by the armed action? These are questions of legitimacy, prudence, as I said. 4, always be predictable, consistent in time, coherent in time. You need to be reliable. Be predictable. That means there must be a line in what you say. What you said 1 week ago should not conflict with what you say today. Once there are incompatibilities and incoherences in what you say, you simply lose your credit and your credibility and your reliability. People won't rely on you. 1 week you say A, next week you say non-A. What's your position? Can I rely on you? No. Am I going to ally myself with you in trying to find, an alliance within the setting of the Security Council to counter somebody? I won't do that, because you're not predictable. So when you are not consistent, you outflank yourself out of the discussion, and for all practical purposes, you don't count anymore in negotiation. So out of the 15, it's already -1. Well, let's say the president was already -1 because he didn't know what he's talking about. Now you have another one, he's -1 because he's not reliable, he's not predictable. He contradicts himself. And so you sometimes end up, and this for sure I can tell you, you sometimes end up in negotiation situations. Well, you also take out the guy who has no objective interest, only come in when you have a relevant interest. And sometimes end up having, in fact, a conversation among 15, which is limited to 5, 6 countries, because they know what you're talking about, they have an interest, they are consistent in their reasoning, predictable, and that kind of things. That's a very important point, predictability. I could again mention one of the countries that was sitting with me in the Security Council, a rather great country, with a very nice ambassador, a good friend of mine, but he was so emotional, I come back to that he always wanted to say too much, and then he started contradicting himself and so on. So it's human. And being consistent with yourself is something that asks a certain effort. Rule number 5. Work step by step through your negotiation. Evolve as the situation evolves. Do not make shortcuts. do not want to have quick fixes. So you see what I mean. Every negotiation has its own dynamics. Sometimes it goes fast, sometimes it goes slow, and you have to evolve with that rhythm. Evolve in terms of not just walk with the dynamics, also in terms of revisiting your positions, which you have not committed yourself yet to, the rule of commitment. That's why another rule would be, don't speak too fast, too often, and put all your cards on the table. Do it step by step. Evolve as the situation evolves. I put one card, not all of them. I put not a card that fixes me too much. I put a rather broad card, which later on I can then narrow down. And I avoid simply to be trapped by what I said, by what I committed to, simply by going the way and coming into the debate as things evolve. If not, you can just, what in Dutch we call u vastrijden. You put yourself, you corner yourself in a corner. So work step by step in negotiation, evolve as the situation evolves. Next rule. Avoid principled statements, stark pronouncement, rigid positions, particularly in relation to legal principles. Why avoid principled statements, rigid pronouncement? Because once you do that, you are, as I said, committed to them. And once you have committed yourself to a rigid principle, you are the hostage of that situation. You cannot come back to that, and the other one will point to you and say, but you said this. You refer to that sacrosanct legal principle of, say, territorial integrity. Well, now you have it, your territorial integrity. We will not budge on anything you ask for. And that would be one possible example, but you have a lot of them. The basic idea being that by such strong principled statements, you narrow your own space of negotiation, and therefore your relative freedom to flexibly play in the game. You have climbed in the tree, and you probably will have a hard time getting out of the tree. Next rule, again, common sense, but it's good to have it before your mind. Calculate at what stage in the negotiation you come in. Make a good calculation at what stage in the negotiation will I come forth with my argument. I have here in my pocket, I have a set of arguments. I've mentally prepared that before the meeting. Very often you write that down on a little paper that is before you. And you see I have arguments. I have strong arguments, less arguments. I have broad arguments, narrow arguments. You have always to think twice when exactly you will come out with a certain card. Because it may be the wrong time to come out with that kind of card. Sometimes it's too early, but sometimes it's too late also. That is, I had a strong argument, but in the meantime, the debate has taken a turn, which means that my argument doesn't make sense anymore. The debate has shifted. So you have really to calculate all the time, do I use that argument now or do I wait for later? If I put it too early, the others may break it down and nothing may be left at the end of negotiation. If I bring it too late, the discussion virtually is done and I don't influence anymore the negotiation. Next rules, and these rules now, the three last ones, there is a kind of logic in the rules that I mentioned. The first one are more or less substantive. The second set of rules are more tactical rules. Now we come to more formal rules. One of them being, always be very clear and articulate in your intervention, be short and conclude. So, this is common sense, really. Be clear and articulate. If you want to convince somebody else that you have it the right way, then make a clear statement. How can you convince somebody else that you are on the right side of the debate when your statement is not clear, it's obfuscated, it's ambiguous, and that kind of things. Basically, that's one of the rules we already mentioned, be perspicuous. So you have to be clear and articulate. But beyond being clear and articulate, you have to be short. One of the biggest mistakes being made in a negotiation situation is when you start talking and you talk and you talk. What is the risk? First, people get impatient. Second, people get tired and are not paying attention anymore to what you say. Third, and that's a real risk, by talking and talking, you start saying too much. So much so that you start contradicting your own position or undermining your own position. So the good rules, and these are indeed, as you see, formal rules, is be clear and articulate in your expression, be short, compact, with an impact of what you say, and conclude. That is, in other terms, Mr. President, my position is that for this and this reason, it's not acceptable that. Clack. Everybody got it, and you make a much more forceful impression on your colleagues than, starting a long dialogue, a long discourse. Ninth rule out of the 10 is avoid emotions. Emotions show your weakness. A negotiation situation is a discursive situation. It's an argumentative situation. You need to bring rational arguments. Nobody will be impressed by emotions in a negotiation situation. Something different is when you have to speak for a certain audience. When you want to sensibilize people, look at Obama, for instance, who is a great speaker and who could very well work on the sentiments of the people. But that is a totally different game. In a negotiation, there's no place for emotions, because emotions are being felt that being short in rational arguments, you have to take recourse to sentiments. And that's, of course, as you can easily understand, a position of weakness. And then the last rule is a very simple rule again. Always have a smile. It shows your self-confidence. Now, to be fair, I added a 10th rule. I had 9 of them. I said, look, I have to go to 10. But then I added it, the rules of always have a smile. And the more I think about it, and the more I speak about that with students, and sometimes others, the more I think it's an important role. When you have that little smile, what do you basically signal to the others? You signal that you have self-confidence. You signal that you are not nervous at all, that you take it at ease, that the others are shouting to each other, standing up, flapping their hand on the thing, and there you are, just observing the situation, asking for the floor, making your statement, and again. So what you do is you impress the others. And the others start thinking that you have it on the right, because otherwise you wouldn't feel that comfortable. Now, you can perhaps use that easily when indeed you are on the right, but the whole talent is, of course, that you are totally on the wrong, that you have to defend a position which basically doesn't make sense, but that's because the instructions from your capital came. You have to defend that position. You tell your people in Brussels, look, doesn't make sense, will never fly. That is exactly the time that you have to show that smile, because it shows how much you feel at ease in this company and how sure you are about your own position. I think time has gone. We will leave it at that. Perhaps next week I'll be in a position to say something on empathy. But as I told you, the core element of empathy, which is not sympathy. Sympathy is siding with the other guy. Empathy is, while totally being in disagreement with the other, still understand him. And understanding not just in terms of I understand what he says, I understand the meaning of what he's telling me. It goes deeper. I start understanding why he's making the point in the first place. And that's the most important part in cognitive empathy. Understanding not what he says, understanding his mind, but understanding why he's making that point. And if you reach a situation in a negotiation setting where you are really able to understand why he's making the point he's making, then you are very close to reaching an agreement, because then you can eliminate all the false problems. A negotiation is full of false problems. The first thing you have to do is to separate a false issue. For instance, an issue where we differ from position, but that difference doesn't play out on the point which is at the discussion. We may have convergent interests, not knowing it from each other. You have freely to go to what is the real point of controversy, and by properly understanding the mind of the other guy, you probably will clear the ground and come to the core itself of the point that is to be discussed. I am very sorry that once again